Hello internet, welcome to the channel. My name's Frankie, and in today's video we're going to be building two small really fun habitats, one for the Common Warthog and the other for the adorable Aardvark. We are continuing our African plains and grasslands kind of area in this video, and we're building firstly for the Warthog. Now, if you've watched my previous video on the Nile monitor, you may recognise this habitat and remember that I made three of these habitat shapes all next to each other in kind of a semicircle kind of thing. So what I'm doing here is I am just selecting all of that African fencing that has been put in front of the wall as a decoration. I'm just highlighting all of that, multi-selecting it so that I can copy and paste that over to our Warthog habitat to make sure that that stage of the habitat is finished, and then we can just entirely focus on what's inside. And once our decoration is put in place, I can move on to making sure there is a null barrier going around this entire habitat to make sure that it registers as an actual habitat rather than just a shape of concrete that the animals exist in, which is I guess what a habitat is, but we need it to register as a habitat so that our zookeepers are going to be visiting and making sure the animals are fed. And once the null barrier is in place, I can make a few little adjustments right at the front of the habitat in order to have our habitat gate in place and just make sure that there are some walls to connect it to the rest of the wall, because obviously I need to remove some to make a little hole for the gate and whatnot. This process is then repeated for the Aardvark habitat, but I'm not going to bother showing you that because it's just exactly the same thing. So let's move on to actually making this a suitable home for our piggies. Normally when I'm building a habitat, I have a rough idea of what I want it to look like before I start. However, for both of these habitats, I didn't really have any idea. So the first thing that I do is to place down the larger enrichment items and food tray. Because these are going to be taking up so much space, it's important to get these in like right at the beginning, and then I can kind of work around them in terms of rock work and like plant life and stuff. And the Warthogs do present a particular challenge in the fact that they have both a foraging box and a mud bath, and these two items are massive, despite the fact that the animals don't actually need that much space. They could live quite happily in a habitat even smaller than this one, but these items do take up quite a lot of space, so it's kind of a balancing act. I kind of just shove them in anywhere I can to begin with, but we're going to have a little shuffle around to just make it look a little bit nicer in a bit. But for now I'm just going to place the rest of the enrichment items, and then we can move on to making this habitat look a little bit more like home. So these animals are going to need a hard shelter, and since the introduction of these faux rocks from the aquatic pack, I don't want to build traditional shelters anymore, those wooden log kind of things. I'm just enjoying making caves far too much. So that is exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to use various aquatic rocks, starting with the taller ones to kind of mark out either side that we can then bridge over the gap of with slightly flatter ones. These faux rocks are really good for this kind of thing. And what I have started to do, what is becoming a bit of a pattern, is I use these super large rocks to begin with to create the shape that I want and all that, and I get it into a really good position where I could have built a cave very similar with traditional rocks, but then I go around with these small faux rock clusters, the little piles of rocks, and put those on any of the flat surfaces around the bottoms and stuff, and it instantly looks so much more dynamic and interesting. And this is just because of the variety in size of the rocks. So if you're wanting any of your rock work to look a little bit more interesting, I would suggest scattering some of the little rock piles around the bottom and whatnot, just because that variety in size is really going to help make it seem quite a bit more interesting. And before we get on to the best bit, which is obviously plastering plants all over this habitat, I don't really like the wooden frames to the mud bath and the foraging pit. I just think they look a bit ugly. It's too man-made for me. So I'm going to try and blend this into its surroundings by using some thin kind of pillar-like rocks I'm going to line the edge of the mud pit and the foraging pit with these really thin rocks. That's going to mask the wooden frame, making it look a lot more organic. And then I can use some more flat rocks to kind of branch out from that point, making it look like this is a muddy outcrop that happens to have a kind of a divot in it where a lot of moisture has collected and created this little mud pit in a natural way. So this is something that I have gotten into the habit of doing since introducing the American bison to Floki Wildlife Park, and I think it just makes these normally quite man-made looking items look a lot nicer. So that would be my suggestion to you. If you don't like the wooden frames on these foraging pits and mud pits, maybe use some rocks to kind of mask it and blend it into the surroundings. And whilst we have the rocks out, the easiest way to improve any water source is to make a few little rocky outcrops at the edges, just to make it look a lot more natural. So that's what I'm going to be doing here, just using a few different sizes of rocks and sink it into the surroundings. Just make it so that the edge of this waterway is nice and stony. Moving on to the plant life, we're going to keep this fairly simple because at the moment it's looking quite deserty, this habitat, and I kind of want to lean into that. So in terms of the trees, we're only going to be using the candelabra trees. I have no idea if that's how it's pronounced, but that's what I'm going with. We're going to keep them fairly spaced out. We don't want to overwhelm this habitat. And then we're going to start placing some of the cacti looking plants that are kind of like an aloe vera, maybe. I'm not entirely sure which ones they are, but they're going to be growing in arid environments. So we're going to pop a few of those around as well. In the water, we're going to use a couple lily pads. We're just going to make a really small cluster of them. And then around the rocks, we're going to use a bunch of common reeds. And something that I haven't used before, which I'm quite excited to be using in this habitat, is the absolutely massive rhubarb plants. They are really, really cool. The leaves are such a unique shape. It's quite a fun plant to be using. So I'm going to put those in a couple of the corners as well, because they take up quite a lot of coverage. So they're quite an easy way of boosting that coverage stat if you're not the biggest fan of doing loads of plant work. And after placing a couple education boards and donation bins, this habitat's done, so we can move on to the Aardvarks. Something else that I did do for the Warthogs but forgot to film, so I'm going to show you whilst I'm building the Aardvark habitat, is to place heaters. These animals are from Africa and we are building in a temperate zoo, and that's just not going to work. So when you've got animals that are in a colder climate than they normally live, what I like to do is take the heaters and sink them slightly into the ground so that they can't be seen. I personally think the heaters are quite an ugly thing, so I like to mask them if I can. The next thing that I do for our Aardvarks is start to place down their enrichment items, which I start with a food bowl and then quickly move on to their shelter, which is going to be the burrow. I have a thing in mind for this. It's just going to be that I place the burrow as normal in a corner, but then I'm going to use some rocks and stuff to try and mask it into like a bit of a cave or something. As for the rest of the enrichment items, I'm going to be fairly random with it, keeping the food items closer to the front so that the guests get a better view, and then spacing out the toy items as much as possible. With the arrival of our Aardvarks, we can start to try and meet their terrain distribution needs, and I was quite surprised. I was expecting these guys to want quite a lot of sand, but they predominantly want soil. They want quite a lot of soil, and to be fair, quite a bit of grass as well, which is unusual. So this habitat ends up being really quite patchy because I am preferring these Africa habitats to be slightly less grassy and more on the sandy and muddy side. So that's kind of where I lean, limiting the grass as much as I can within reason. Back over at the burrow, I start to create that kind of cave structure that I was talking about. And it's really quite simple to do. All I'm doing is using various faux rocks to just kind of enclose that burrow entrance. Make it look as though it's kind of been carved out at the bottom of this by the Aardvarks, because they're getting a bit of natural shelter above ground as well as below it. Now, all of the basic principles of how I do this kind of thing apply from before. So using little rock clusters and stuff to make it look a little bit more interesting, and starting with the bigger boulders in order to get our basic shape in place. Nothing fancy, but it does make quite a bit of a difference. Another thing that this habitat has in common with the Warthog habitat is that they have a foraging box that I am going to bury using the stones. It's exactly the same as before. I'm using those long, thin stones to mask the wooden frame of this scavenger box. I do end up using some slightly smaller stones as well, just to kind of mix up the texture, create a bit more variation and stuff like that. Now, if there's one thing that I know about the Aardvarks that I've learned from story mode, well, not story mode, this isn't that kind of game, career mode, it's that they're quite nervous creatures. They get stressed out pretty easily. So how you combat this is make sure that they have plenty of room to hide, at least in a habitat like this. If you had higher barriers, you could make sure that the barriers were made out of one-way glass, or at least had one-way glass windows. That is a really good way of stopping animals from being stressed. You can also sink the do not disturb signs into the ground, but what I'm going for here is a more natural option, and that is to use the rocks to create a kind of barrier. We're creating a bit of a wall in the middle of the habitat that means the animals can go around and use the back portion of this habitat in secrecy, away from the eyes of our guests, which is going to stop them getting stressed out so easily. So that is a really good, natural looking way of remedying that issue. And I'm just making this by using various sized rocks. They're all Savannah rocks because I like the rocks to match quite a bit. However, the faux rocks do look slightly different. I don't overly mind. I think it's not too starkly different, so that variation is actually quite nice. In fact, I even use these small rock clusters from the faux rocks just to kind of add a bit more natural looking textures to the ground, because at the moment it's just really large rocks. These smaller ones are going to help to break it up and make it look a lot more natural. So spreading it out makes that cave at the back look a lot less stark in comparison, because before doing this it stood out quite a bit. But by spreading out these rocks around the entire habitat, making them be quite integrated with the natural rocks, it's going to look a lot more natural having that cave at the back. You're not really going to question it because they are spread out across the entire habitat. So that's a good way of kind of blending the two types of rocks together. Just make sure you're mixing them up quite a bit. Now, ordinarily, I almost always go for a natural water source in my habitats. However, I want this one to be really quite arid and dry looking. So I'm going to use the water pump as the water source in this habitat to ensure that we can have a nice small one. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to hide the actual pump and the majority of the bowl at the bottom in amongst the rocks. To do that, I'm simply sinking it into some rocks that I placed earlier, and then I'm going to try and use some rocks and such to kind of mask that concrete lip and blend it in a little bit. In terms of the plant life being used in this habitat, I'm going to try and roughly match what was used in the warthog habitat. So the species of tree that I use in this habitat are the exact same kind, but there are even fewer. We're going to be leaning into those aloe vera like plants quite a bit more, and we're going to use generally quite dry looking plants in here. Now, I'm just going to stop talking for a minute and let you enjoy the rest of this habitat build and get your little Floki facts about these animals, and then we'll be back for the grand reveals. Thank you so much for having watched this video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel, as I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers at the moment and we're getting pretty close, which is very exciting. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.